Got it. Good morning. Welcome to our adult Christian formation today. We're continuing on the devil and the details. We're looking at Satan and evil and the devil in scripture and how evil persists today. We've had some good conversations so far. Last week we kind of ended on we looked through some major passages in the Old Testament that use the word Satan, Satan in Hebrew. And kind of concluded that it wasn't the same as what we would think of for Satan today, whether you're thinking of the red tail horns in hell with the pitchfork, or even just Satan, the figure tempted Jesus, this kind of opposing God type thing. And the Old Testament was more either a court figure, like the official accuser who kept people in line and checked on things. It could be like in the story of Balaam and the donkey, just somebody who is an adversary sent from God to churn your path some direction. And then we got into the last passage just at the end there from First Chronicles, which was Satan getting David to count the armies, even though God and everybody else said don't count the armies. So that was the first instance of sort of Satan, the sort of devil on the shoulder thing whispering. So today we're going to go over a couple of other passages in the Old Testament that don't use the word Satan, but are often said to be part of this. Where does this come from? This image of Satan or Lucifer or all these different roots. So we'll look at a couple of those, and then I have a couple of bonus things that I looked up this week to round this one out. So first off, Genesis 3. That's the fall, right? That's where original sin started. Genesis 1, Genesis 2, you have creation, Adam and Eve in the garden, all is good, there's a tree, don't eat from the tree. So that's actually chapter 3. Here's this tree, the knowledge of good and evil, don't eat from the tree. And then the serpent is like, hiss, 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 no, it's good, no, God just doesn't want you to be like God, and, no, really good. Eve gets all the credit for this, but Adam was standing there, like, she dialogue, he's the one that opened her mouth and talked, but he was standing there and they both ate the fruit. Never says it was an apple, by the way. Where that came from later, but it's just some kind of fruit. Maybe a pomegranate.
Fruit from the tree of knowledge.
That's right. So, star fruit. What fruit is what is the wisest fruit? So yeah, they share, they eat the fruit, and it all goes to heck, right? They get kicked out of the garden. So in later Christian history, a lot of folks went back, well, here's the serpent doing the things that we understand Satan to do. Tempting, lying, making folks do things that were against God's will. And so there you go. The craftiest, the wisest of creatures, but it's still a creature. And later on you get things about Moses lifting up a serpent and to heal things only, because that doesn't fit. But then you have later on, there's passages in the New Testament that talk about, Satan as the father of lies. Well, clearly it goes all the way to the beginning with the serpent. So there's all these competing thoughts of what serpents do. Yes, I suppose. Oh.
Students.
So hopefully nobody shows up late. Where did everybody go? So there's a whole section in the book we've been looking at that just says, here I just summarized it. There's a big discussion of Genesis 3. Serpent, they did a word study on the word serpent. All the times that serpents and snakes show up in the Old Testament, even into the New Testament. And it says, it's not the same thing. It's not talking about Satan, not originally. And if you think that snake equals serpent, or snake or serpent equals Satan, well, it crops up all these different times, and that doesn't work either. So it really just has to do with that whole lying, tempting thing, and they just got brought into it. But then I'm not going to get into the snake stuff a lot, because it's just not there. We can go back and say, was the serpent Satan or an agent of evil or all those things, but if you look at the Hebrew, if you look at the tradition, it's just not there. It's something that got grafted on to our concept of evil and the devil a couple centuries later, generations later. after the Old Testament.
So you say that the serpent lied to Adam and Eve, and did the serpent lie? He told them that they would know the difference between good and evil when they ate. This was a debate we had one time.
Yeah.
So he just told them basically that you would know, and really when they ate the fruit, they got the knowledge that they didn't have before.
No, the lie was the part.
You would be like God, was the one I saw.
That and hold on, should have had this open. Did God say, "You shall not eat from any tree"? Yes. Okay, don't eat from that tree. And then the serpent said to the woman, "You will not die." So they said, "If you touch it, you will die." Maybe, we could get all metaphorical on it, like, was it a spiritual death? Was it a death of innocence? But they didn't die for eating it. So God knows, but
because God took pity on them, they did not die.
Yeah, so the serpent twists things to make it seem like God would be jealous. So maybe it's not so much a straight up lie as it is a distortion.
Eventually they did die.
Eventually.
Well, because God took away
Yeah.
took them away from the tree of life.
Yeah.
Right.
So is it a lie? Is it a distortion of the truth? Yeah. Either way, it wasn't.
No, I agree with that. No, it was just one of those things where we're like, did the serpent lie to them? Because we're talking about it for a long time. It was
No, but ultimately they didn't believe God.
right. That's always got to be the woman's fault in the Old Testament. We found out too.
Oh,
So
Rebecca, Rachel. I mean, you go down a list. They're all.
Jacob did plenty of stuff.
No, it's funny though. They always blame it on the woman every time they read it. Like, wait a minute.
So our two Hebrew professors were both women. One was a deacon that ended up getting ordained as a pastor as well. Another was a pastor. In fact, her last name was Fritschel, and that was like the Fritschels were some of the founding members of Wartburg Seminary and professors for generations. So we had this amazing two professors. And then another professor's wife was the Hebrew language instructor, so she was the one that taught us all the ins and outs. So we had three women teaching us Hebrew, and one of them said, in Hebrew, there's a tradition, there's a tendency that when you're making a list, that you build up to the greatest thing. So that the last thing in the list is always the highest exalted. And so therefore, during creation, in Genesis 2, what's the last thing to get created? Eve. They wanted to make sure
Leaving the best for last.
So anyway, there's that. I always think Eve gets a bum rap because, like I said, Adam wasn't like off stage. Like it says she turned to her, like he was right there. So she just used her words. Let's see. I'm trying to think if there's anything else in here. They get into a lot of stuff about other traditions in the ancient world. Other, like we mentioned Gilgamesh the other week. So there's another one called Enuma Elish from Babylon. Tiamat, the goddess of salt water and chaos. And, Leviathan, is that the same thing as a serpent? And the behemoth, is that the same thing as a different animal? So they go through all these different things from the surrounding cultures and other languages. So here we go. How then does one arrive at the presupposition that the serpent denotes only evil or Satan? He quotes one commentator. In John's gospel, the serpent was a negative symbol because the whole the father of lies and crush the snake underfoot just like Eve. As a result, Judas becomes by the possession the seed of the serpent, Satan, the son of perdition. Other biblical understandings add to the negative nature. Leviticus, it's on the list of things not to eat. There's an intertestamental thing, 4th Maccabees. That's like the Maccabees are 4 different versions of where the Hanukkah story comes from. The Hanukkah tradition. But yeah, it mostly comes from John's Gospel. The serpent doesn't show up much in scripture, in Hebrew scriptures. It kind of goes through Moses lifts it up to healing. There's the thing where the lion and the lamb, the asp and the child, so snakes end up being okay. It's just, it's just an animal. It's a predator. But it ends up being ambiguous. It's in the New Testament, you get a little bit of that tie into the lying Satan, father of lies there, acts as the magician who is the son of the devil, full of deceit. And gets tied into the serpent. 1 Timothy 3 portrays an individual who can easily be deceived through pride by the devil. This, of course, reinforces the tempting nature. So again, it's all the temptation stuff ends up just getting wrapped up with snakes and serpents. But there's no direct, oh yeah, by the way, the snake was the devil. All along, like the end of a Scooby-Doo episode. Who was the serpent? It's the devil. Get out of here. It wasn't for you meddling humans and dogs. So there's nothing quite that direct. Okay. Thus, the story in Genesis 3 is not about Satan bringing death and sin into the world, but rather about the trial and testing of humanity that God had planned. So that too could fall into that role that Satan, the accuser, plays. But again, it's not explicitly said. No definite article, blah, blah, blah. So another commentator says that Genesis doesn't want to shift the blame from humanity to the serpent. It all comes down to the humans, and that's the other debate we've been having. Does sin and evil come from humans and our sinning, or is it from the devil making us do it, or the devil being the active force of evil behind it all? And there's different implications depending on how we fall on that debate. Okay, so again, through this discussion of Genesis 3 and the temptation of the garden, we've determined that the text makes no mention of the figure of the Satan, and only through later anachronistic, so reading back into it, readings of the passage can one align the serpent with the Satan. I'll come back to that later. So the one I want to spend a little more time on today is there's I thought an obscure passage in Isaiah that talks that a lot of folks throughout tradition have said, well, this is the whole Lucifer falling from heaven bit, and that's the devil. So we'll get into that one a little bit. Isaiah 14, 3 to 21. I almost left out my question. Is it different to reinterpret? Okay, that's what I was saying. So there are certain prophecies in the Old Testament that weren't about Christ. Right? They were about coming back from exile. It was about the restoration of the land, but they did talk about the Messiah from the line of David who would come. They weren't thinking about 400 or 500 years later Christ being born when those prophecies were made, but God is not limited to that. So then when Christ was born and folks saw the authority that he had and what he taught and healed and the miracles and signs he performed and then dying and being raised, folks looked back to the scriptures, as you do, to make sense of things, and they said, oh, this is the prophecy fulfilled. This is the Messiah. And that's okay. So is it okay? On the one hand, we reinterpret those prophecies in light of Christ. Now we understand these in a new way. So does that mean that we shouldn't say, oh, well, clearly looking back, the serpent was Satan? Right? So there's a question too, just in terms of how you interpret the Bible. If we reinterpret prophecies to say, yes, these are about Christ, then why can't we go back to the snake and say, this is an early sign through our Christian lens to say here is the devil at work in one of those many roles that we've already talked about. So I don't know, what do you think of that? I know opening a can of worms on biblical interpretation.
It's very difficult to reading, let's say, the Old Testament Satan, the accuser, to not think that maybe that is the Hasatan, the accuser, working through it. He got in the way of the ass. He tortured Job. These are the ways, it was allowed to do it. So did, but then God punishes the serpent. He doesn't separate the serpent as a person of the court.
Yep.
He punishes the serpent as a individual, not a angelic figure.
Yep. And
you will slither on your belly forever and stuff like that. So was it just one of his creations that went amok, or did he use that creation to, do this? And it's not Satan, it's not the accuser, it's just the serpent as he was.
yeah, the wisest of all the creatures.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Give me the question again.
okay, so we already interpret Old Testament things through a Christian lens. And understand them in ways that they maybe weren't originally intended to be, but that fulfill and explain things for our Christian understanding. And the New Testament quotes and alludes to the Old Testament all the time and reinterprets things. So, you know, we do that too. So since it's okay for us to reinterpret Old Testament prophecies about Christ to understand them in that way, can we also then layer on some Christian understandings of Satan into the Old Testament? So I'm doing the scholarly book here. It's like, well, you know, this isn't, it doesn't actually talk about Satan here, but is it okay to add that? You know, where's that line? I guess is the question. How much do we read into the Old Testament through our Christian lens? Maybe you haven't thought
Well,
about this.
we've read a lot into it when we pick up all those passages in Isaiah and say that refers to the Jesus that came. I mean, we're doing a lot of reading into it
Yeah.
already, right?
You know, when we get every Christmas time or Advent, we find that one passage from, I think, Micah about Bethlehem. And, oh, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and we put those together, right? Isaiah, the light, you know, people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. We put that with John, and the light shone in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So the suffering servant in Isaiah, that's Jesus who suffered for our sins. So yeah, we do that already. I guess my question is, I guess we could do that with the devil too.
Again, if you're reading Isaiah and the author makes all these predictions or starts to talk about, sometimes he's talking about when the Romans wipe out the city in 70 AD, and sometimes he's talking about the eternal kingdom.
Yeah.
And maybe all those are just one thing. Maybe we're reading into it when we think there's several different incidences he's talking about. I don't know how you know.
Mhm.
It's just what you.
Yeah. Or maybe God knows that we have a tendency to make our history repeat itself. So, if it replied before, it will apply.
Don't we
again.
say, man, we are sinful by nature, we are, you know,
What's the confession? We are
yeah,
captive to sin.
We cannot free ourselves.
it cannot, yeah, that
Yeah,
we're born into sin,
Yeah.
you know?
that's the fall, the original sin that's on us. I'm gonna share a little Luther on that later. But yeah, and then it comes back to again, is it the devil behind the sin that we're caught in? Is sin our own consequence? If God does allow the devil to do these accusing and attempting roles, what does that mean? Is God in charge then of Satan, or Satan?
I think I was taught that God gives us he gives us a mind that we can make our own decisions.
Yeah.
And I don't think every time I make a big decision, it's the devil standing over me do it. I did it, you
Yeah.
know?
Well,
It might be nicer when you blame the devil, but
have you ever heard of the Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis?
No.
So it's a series of letters back and forth between like middle management demon and low level demon. Wormwood, I think we talked about it a little bit the other day. Screw Tape Letters has a line, a very famous line. I like this line. That the devil's greatest trick was convincing the world he didn't exist. Right? And I was wondering, well, maybe it's convincing the world that everything is his fault. Because if the devil made
and they
you
do it.
Uh-huh.
then
Saturday Night
that
Live.
removes some of that responsibility
But
from me.
we have God talking to us, showing us, telling us, leading us to do the right thing. And then there's the devil who's leading us. Right. We have the power to listen to God. He gave us that power, but I can't tell you how many times I forget to do the right thing and go with the wrong thing. Is that the devil's fault? that's my
our
fault.
choice.
I'm the one who's making that choice.
Right.
Like in the middle of the night when I wake up hungry, and being a diabetic, I know there's not so much I can eat, but I go get a piece of chocolate candy. I mean,
And that's where that image of the devil and the angel on your shoulders comes from. And Paul even says in Romans 7, I think, you know, I do not do the good I know I should do.
Mhm.
I can't remember it exactly, but I do the evil thing I don't want to do. Why is that? And so this is again, all of these questions are age old.
I was raised in that. Be sober, be watchful, your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion,
Yeah.
seeking whom he will destroy. That was the fundamental church that we learned that.
Well, here,
Yeah.
that's a good one. That's a really good segue to
Mhm.
one of my bonus things. So we'll come back to Lucifer. Let's go off topic a little bit. Have you ever heard of something called sinners in the hands of an angry God?
No.
Does that ring a bell?
Uh-huh.
This,
Sounds familiar.
Sinners in the hands of an angry God.
this is a famous sermon given by Jonathan Edwards, one of the early colonial governors, I think. Or maybe his brother was, I don't know. Early colonial figure, we'll say it like that. This was preached at Enfield on July 8th, 1741, at a time of great awakenings. Remember, they were having these revivals, with remarkable impressions on many of the hearers. So this is, speaking of biblical interpretation, this sermon,
That's not a Lutheran sermon.
I mean, it is, you know, condensed, but that sermon is based on part of one verse. Deuteronomy 32:35. It's not even the whole verse. Their foot shall slide in due time. In this verse is threatened the vengeance of God on the wicked, unbelieving Israelites who were God's invisible people and who lived under the means of grace, but who, notwithstanding all God's wonderful works towards them, remained void of counsel, having no understanding. Under all the cultivations of heaven, they brought forth bitter and poisonous fruit, as in the two verses next preceding the text. The expression I have chosen for my text, their foot shall slide in due time, seems to imply the following things relating to the punishment and destruction to which these wicked Israelites were exposed. Now, before I continue, just keep this in mind next time you see a Thanksgiving pageant with all the nice Puritans, right? This is the Puritan theology here, at least a corner of it. Okay, so this is his take on human sinfulness, right? That they were always exposed to destruction, as one that stands or walks in slippery places is always exposed to fall. This is implied in the manner of their destruction coming upon them, being represented by their foot sliding in due time. It's going to happen. It's a matter of time. It's when, not if. The same expressed. Okay. This is long, so I want to skip to the really disturbing parts. The observation from the words that I would now insist upon is this: there is nothing that keeps wicked men at any one moment out of hell but the mere pleasure of God. By the mere pleasure of God, I mean his sovereign pleasure, his arbitrary will, restrained by no obligation, hindered by no manner of difficulty, any more than if nothing else but God's mere will had in the least degree or in any respect whatsoever any hand in the preservation of wicked men one moment. The truth of this observation may appear by the following considerations. And he goes through all this stuff about how humans are horrible. We deserve nothing but God's wrath. And only by God's good pleasure could we ever not fall into hell. He doesn't talk so much about heaven as not going to hell. And he talks about, he's really aiming this even at people in his own congregation who have basically not had that conversion experience, who haven't given themselves over to God, been baptized, and converted their lives. And he talks about how they deserve to be cast into hell. So that divine justice never stands in the way. It makes no objection against God's using his power at any moment to destroy them. Yea, on the contrary, justice calls aloud for an infinite punishment of their sin. The sword of divine justice is at every moment brandished over their heads, and it is nothing but the hand of arbitrary mercy and God's mere will that holds it back. Later on, he talks about basically the big lake of fire, and it's just God's hand. And at any moment, God would be like, and whip the hand out, and people fall. And then the only mention of Satan or devils are, they're just waiting. come on, God, move your hand, or wait, like mouths open, ready to gulp down. So that it's this long sermon. It just goes on and on. So that thus it is that natural men are held in the hand of God over the pit of hell. They have deserved the fiery pit and are already sentenced to it. And God is dreadfully provoked. His anger is great towards them, as to those that are actually suffering the executions of the fierceness of his wrath in hell. And they have done nothing in the least to appease or abate that anger. Neither is God in the least bound by any promise to hold them up one moment. The devil is waiting for them. Hell is gaping for them. The flames gather and flash about them, and with vain lay hold on them, and swallow them up. The fire pent up in their own hearts is struggling to break out, and they have no interest in any mediator. There are no means within reach that can buy any security to them, that can be any security to them. In short, they have no refuge, nothing to take hold of. Sorry, Psalm 46, mighty fortress thing. Of all that preserves them every moment is the mere arbitrary, that word again, the mere arbitrary will and uncovenanted, unobliged forbearance of an incensed God. Where's your fire and brimstone?
Thank God for Martin Luther who came along and,
This is after Luther.
Yeah,
yeah, but that's why I said, at least he gives you something else to think about.
Do you believe this, or it's just a way of controlling people?
Oh, shoot,
Make
I got
them-
the-
make them fear enough.
I mean, it is fear.
Yeah.
It's scaring people straight, right?
Uh-huh.
And
Churches like that.
there are some churches like that, and there's a long tradition. And the Roman Catholic Church did the same thing, maybe a different version of it.
Yeah.
For a long time. Lutheran churches have done that before. It's not no branch of Christianity is immune to the fire and brimstone, I just don't understand how you can share the gospel
And the
that
good news.
liberates through the vehicle of, if you don't believe in God, you're going to hell. It doesn't fit for me. And Luther talks about hell, he talks about, sinfulness a lot. There's a whole thing in here, I grabbed the wrong one, this is some of Luther's writings. There's a whole piece he wrote, and I will read you the full title of it, about the bondage of the will. So in life, yes, free will, we make choices, we live with the consequences, but he has an issue with this other theologian by saying that we have any part to play, that the choices we make can give us salvation. He draws the line there, but this is the full title of that piece. Concerning the letter and the spirit, from answer to the, okay, so this is, answer to the hyper-Christian, hyper-spiritual, and hyper-learned book by Goat Emser in Leipzig. So that's, the title of it is saying this guy's a goat, he's overqualified, he thinks he's all that, let me take him down a couple notches and see what he's. So that's, let me grab my other book. Talk amongst yourselves, the Amos runs.
keep it PG. You asked, do they really believe it? I don't think you can do it. How long that sermon was and not really believe it. Yeah, Puritans were a different view.
This is the book I would get. Remember our good old Book of Concord, Rich Catechism discussion? So we're gonna look at a couple other parts of this real quick. The first thing in here is called the Augsburg Confessions. Luther and others worked on this together to basically say against the Catholic Church, here is our confession, here's our understanding of these different tenets of the faith, and then the next section is called the Apology to the Confession, where they answer back to the Empire's replies. So 37. This section is called Concerning Original Sin. Likewise, they, Catholic Church at the time, likewise they teach that since the fall of Adam, all human beings who are propagated according to nature are born with sin, that is, without fear of God, without trust in God, and with concupiscence, which is the technical Catholic legal term about motivation behind the sin and stuff. And they teach that this disease or original fault is truly sin, which even now damns and brings eternal death to those who are not born again through baptism in the Holy Spirit. They condemn the Pelagians, that's a heretical teaching by a guy named Pelagius, and others who deny that the original fault is sin, and who, in order to diminish the glory of Christ's merits and benefits, argue that human beings can be justified before God by their own powers or reason. So this is squarely putting all the blame on humans. Not in as fiery a terms, there's, it's Lutherans, there's grace in here too. It just draws a line to say humans can't save themselves, but it is humans' fault. It is that original sin that we're born into that is staying with us. In the back, there's this thing called the Formula of Concord. There's two different versions. Now, the Augsburg Confession, that was written in like the 1520s, right? No, that's not right. A little later than that. The Formula of Concord, these two different versions weren't written until the 1570s. So Luther and Melanchthon were long past, and they kept arguing amongst themselves, all the different reformers, over the fine points of all of this. So finally they had the Formula of Concord. Okay, we're all going to finally agree on this theology. So I want page 491. And this is from the version called the Epitome. There's also a version called the Solid Declaration. The Epitome says, okay. Here we go. Concerning original sin. Whether original sin is really without any distinction the corrupted nature, substance, and essence of the human creature, or indeed the most important and best part of its essence, as the rational soul itself as the height of its development and powers, or whether even after the fall there is a distinction between human substance, nature, essence, body, and soul in original sin, in such a way that human nature is one thing and original sin, which is embedded in the corrupted nature, and which corrupts this nature, is another. Okay. It just basically is saying, is original sin something separate, or is it a part of who we intermixed? They come down to say it is that God created humans and humans are good, and so therefore human nature by itself is good. And at the same time, because Lutherans like to do both and, there is original sin that we cannot escape, that is part of us, that we are born into, that corrupts the good thing that God made. So inextricably snared together, but still two different things, is the Lutheran take on original sin. So still putting the blame on us as humans all the way back to original sin. No mention of the devil here. Whispering that kind of stuff. If you look at the Small Catechism, it says, lead us not to temptation. Well, we know God doesn't tempt anybody, but we do ask God to protect us from temptations. Right? So that would be what Marilyn was saying before. We make the choices. Is it, whether it's the devil or just ourselves leading us down the bad paths, it's still our choice in the end. So, when it comes to those sinful things. So it's not, Luther comes down kind of the same way that Jonathan Edwards does, that it is all our fault. But Luther's much more emphatic on the grace and on what God does to intervene, that what God created is good. That's a big difference. Human nature is good. God loves us. God created us and we are good. Jonathan here would be like, no, there's nothing good about humans. We're just corrupt and bad. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, no wonder Christians had a hard time, getting converts when they had to resort to things like the Inquisition or keeping people illiterate or scaring them with indulgences or fire and brimstone sermons and, oh, you didn't show up to church on Sunday, like a lot of intimidation to keep people in line, as opposed to what I think is an under-treasured, under-advertised part of Lutheran theology, is that we don't do good things to earn God's love and get into heaven. We do good things because of God's love, and we can't help but respond in kind and be little Christs, be freed for service and love to others. What a treasure that is, that God's love is just a constant, and we can't help but then respond by loving our neighbors. as opposed to if you don't love your neighbors, you're going to hell. I mean, read you one other section here.
Bonhoeffer talked about that in his book, what was it, Obedience and Faith? You know,
Sounds right.
it's like a giant circle, they're chasing each other, but finally you have to really have both, yeah.
Which he wrote at a time when he was struggling with the ethical things to do with the Nazi regime. So do you,
Oh.
I believe, it's the one I'm thinking of. So do I love my neighbors, even my Jewish neighbors? How does that look? How does that play out? Do I be obedient?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Because his whole, what makes him still stand out so much is that he came of age alongside the Nazi rhetoric infecting the churches and coming to the forefront in the politics too. And he had family members like in-laws and good friends who were Jewish. And so at first he was, well, yeah, don't let there be don't lose separation of church and state, right? And then he had to ethically keep adjusting his stances to include not just Christians with Jewish heritage, but all Jews. And he didn't get there overnight either. His writing and his thoughts and his confession changed over time.
And there's a guy who walked in Jesus' footsteps, didn't he?
Yeah, and maybe Jesus wouldn't have said, let's go assassinate the emperor. But Jesus would have forgiven him on the cross next to him.
Mhm.
Said, you're with me today in paradise. But I don't see that Bonhoeffer could see any other way out. And everybody else around him was kind of just going along with it, keeping the heads down, or embracing it. So one other bit from the Formula of Concord. For the difference between God's work and the devil's work can be made most clear through these words, because the devil cannot create a substance, but can only corrupt the substance, which God has created in an accidental way. There's another theological term that means there's the substance and then the accidents. It's a Latin thing that means, well, I haven't looked it up. It's like the outer stuff, the changeable stuff. So God's purview is creation. So the devil cannot create, but can only corrupt what God has created. So if the devil has a role, if it started out as the court accuser or the adversary on certain things, as we saw in the Old Testament, and then as Jesus came on the scene and was the Son of God and talked about the kingdom of heaven, and you had all these ways of understanding the world that were yin yang, either or, dual nature, well then what is against the kingdom of God? That would be the kingdom of man, which is ruled by the devil. And the devil corrupts. And what corrupts? Lies corrupt, gossip corrupts. Where we see instances of gossip and lies in the scripture, work your way backward. That's how you get there. So we're making our own choices. This is where I'm figuring this out as we go too. So today, after reading all this stuff, I'm saying, well, we make our own choices. We're the source of sin, but the devil is corrupting, and the devil is pushing and tempting, and leading us down that.
But you say the earth is the kingdom of Satan. People keep saying that.
Mhm.
Where is that biblically? And I don't know, as far as is it because we
Paul-
say we are the kingdom of heaven, the church is the kingdom, right? So are we not, in the kingdom of heaven as well? I mean,
Right.
the dual.
I would say so. I think if you read John's gospel, it talks about, they're in the world, but they're not of the world.
Mhm.
That we kind of have a foot in both. And, Luther says, I pray in the Lord's Prayer that the kingdom of heaven happens without our praying for it, but I also pray through this prayer that it would happen in and through us.
Mhm.
So Paul uses a lot of rhetoric, right? Paul was a gifted rhetorical speaker. And so he would say, well, Adam did this, Jesus did that. You know, it's classic argument style of the time. Well, if the kingdom of heaven is this, that means we're in the kingdom of heaven, you know, flesh and spirit, all those either ors that Paul would do to prove a point. If folks really, you know, grasped onto that, to say that's how the world is, you know, was Paul just using that as an illustration? Or was he describing the reality? We can debate that too. But a lot of it comes out of later New Testament stuff. That since there's sin in the world, you know, God created the world, but the devil corrupts. It's that same sort of line of thought. So that means for now, just like the devil tempted Jesus, for now the devil's, you know, ruling this world. Well, speaking of the devil, let's talk Lucifer for a minute. And then I got some questions. I'm talking more this time, sorry about that. But I'm appreciating all the figuring things out together. Okay. Isaiah 14, 3-21, the fall of Satan. In Isaiah 13 and 14, we observe the prophet proclaiming an oracle against the nations, in particular against Babylon. Within this oracle, we find a graphic description of the coming judgment of Babylon on the day of the Lord, in which, through the army of the Medes, the nation will fall along with its self-exalted leader. This leader, identified in chapter 14 as the king of Babylon, has been understood for centuries by scholars and preachers as the Satan, Lucifer, the devil. This understanding has led many to suggest that Isaiah 14 is describing the fall of Satan. The origins of this understanding began in the 4th century, right? Not in during the exile. With early church theologians. Jerome, who was a famous church historian and theologian, in his commentary on Isaiah, translated the Hebrew Hallel ben Shapar as shining one, son of the dawn, which is translated as Lucifer in Latin. So one guy translated the Hebrew, and then the Latins translated the Hebrew into Latin, and that's where you get Lucifer, meaning light bearer. And light bearer, the term light bearer in Latin, was used to identify the planet Venus. Where's my cursor here? Was used to identify the planet Venus. Okay. From the time of the Vulgate, the Latin Bible, in the late 4th century until the early 1600s. Interestingly, Jerome only used this term to personify the Satan, while in other Old Testament passages, he uses the same phrase to simply refer to the morning or daylight. So one influential translator helped get us the idea that Lucifer was the light bearer, and higgledy-piggledy back to that.
Is that like saying that King James is the only version of the Bible that we should listen to?
You know, I think the more translations you read, you get a fuller picture. And then it gets into all this context. I can sum that up for you. Just, I had one other passage. Okay. Isaiah 14:12 contains the focal point of this passage, for which the early church fathers drew their understanding that the author was referring to the fallen angel Satan figure. Verse 12 reads, "How you fell from heaven, O shining one, son of the dawn. You were cut down to the ground, O conqueror of the nations." Okay, we already talked about that translation. Jerome called it Lucifer. Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Old Testament. They, you know, again, other Greek writings of the time used it to identify Venus. As a result, some have attempted to draw a parallel to the Greek story of Phaeton. That myth describes the efforts of the hero of the story to secure proof of his divine lineage from his father. He requests permission from his father Helios, that was the guy who drove the sun chariot before Apollo, to drive the solar chariot for a day, something his father attempts to dissuade him from doing. However, he fails to change his son's mind, and in the end can only counsel him on steering the horses. Phaeton is to avoid flying too low, so as not to burn up the earth, and he is not to fly too high, so he doesn't burn up the sky. So he sets off, he fails to control the mighty steeds, and he sets fire to the sky and the earth. As a result, Zeus is forced to strike him from the chariot, at which point his body, burning with fire, falls to the earth as a star from heaven. The myth is primarily a lesson on the dangers of hubris and the divine punishment for human pride. Okay. where you see some similarities. If you get a little too big for your britches. The passage reads, you said in your heart, I will go up to the heavens above the stars of God, I will set my throne, and I will sit on the mountain of the assembly in the heights of the north. This is again in Isaiah 14. All this language is, of course, familiar from Babylonian and Assyrian kings who exalted themselves to divine status. Caesar did this too. And in the eyes of the people, and perhaps also in the surrounding nations. So you're up on a mountain. The author of Isaiah 14 makes it clear that all this prideful talk is for naught. This once powerful king of Babylon will be cast down just as those kings who await him in Sheol, the land of the shades. He will die the simple death of a man who made the earth tremble and the kingdoms quake. In his death, he will no longer hold his divine status and power, and will spend his time in Sheol awaiting judgment. Okay, so here's my take on this. If you read Isaiah 13 and 14, it's not about Satan. It's not about the devil. It's talking about what the Old Testament talks about so many other places. What the surrounding countries and cultures talked about is that if you overreach, you're gonna get brought down. Whether it's through your own hubris and pride, you give a person enough rope, right? Or you put yourself so high, others will take you down. Even think Harry Potter, right? So spoiler alert, book 7. There's the guy who has the Elder Wand, the most powerful wand, and can kill anybody. Well, he goes to sleep, so somebody steals it because he bragged about it so much. So right, okay, you set yourself up. The natural thing is that you're going to get knocked back down. So that's what Isaiah is doing. You're about to get dragged off into exile in Assyria. Well, the Assyrian kings think so highly of themselves, they too will be brought down from their high and lofty thrones, and they'll fall from their shining mountain top and get brought down, die a ignoble death, right? So, again, one translation led to a second translation that said, oh, that's Lucifer, the light bearer. It's an angel. Next week, we're going to get into the intertestamental stuff, the other things that aren't in the Bible, the Apocrypha, the pseudepigrapha, right? These false writings. And that's where a lot of this stuff comes from in the New Testament that says, oh, you take this part from the Old Testament. So that's what we're going to get into. So, I mentioned this last week. Does evil come from human or the devil? In this instance of Lucifer, of the Lucifer story, the Bible is consistent, both testaments, when talking about hubris, pride, and the mighty being brought low. Mary even sings about it in the Magnificat. Said that last week. The mighty get brought low. So we tend to be our own worst enemies. If you do go down the line of, oh, the devil made me do it, that's a cop-out. That's the same line of thinking that says, I can do what I want, God will forgive me. That's cheap grace, right? It's removing any responsibility from yourself, either for the sin or the forgiveness, or the repentance, I should say. What's that mean? Page 67. It's 67 green. Apparently, I used the green highlighter. Here we go. It's the part I read. The gospel uses the language for Jesus as reminiscent of the language of Caesar. I just said that Caesar is God. And also think of Ecclesiastes, right? All of this is vanity and a chasing after the wind. We're all going to die. All the stuff that we build up, make ourselves so mighty, it doesn't matter. We're going to die. We're going to be dust to dust. So there again, I don't think this is talking about, and the scholar doesn't either, but it seems pretty clear to me that this isn't a passage about Satan falling. This is just normal Bible telling the truth. The mighty will fall. If you make yourself mighty, it'll probably have some irony to it on your way down. Human choices, original sin, these produce an evil world. It's Satan's realm. He is tempting people, but is Satan causing evil, or is it just our own choices, tendencies, and original sin? So, I don't know, Darren, this was one of your original questions. Why does evil still hang around in the world? What are you thinking now that we've had 3 weeks of just kind of
I'm
slogging through all of this stuff?
still, my original thought is that I'm still more inclined to humans do it, not, the devil does not make us do anything. We choose.
And what role do you think now, after 3 weeks, that the devil plays in all of this?
I still struggle with that is because God is good,
Yep.
does he allow?
Yeah.
I don't, the more of the translation, like we're picking these things apart, is the devil a creation of man to give us a scapegoat?
Oh,
Evil, yes, there is evil in the world, but is it in our hearts? And we created Satan to give us a scapegoat. Is there the accuser there, or is it God just challenging us to be better? And we just didn't like what we were told to do.
because that is the original question that this book asks, that, you know, at the end, I'm hoping we'll get his thoughts on it. I haven't read ahead yet. That is the can of worms. If the devil has, whatever role the devil has to play, ruler of the world, tempter, accuser, adversary, liar, father of all lies, right? Whatever role the devil has to play, if we believe that God is sovereign, powerful, and in charge, then what does it mean that the devil is doing these things? Because if the devil is autonomous and gets to do this stuff on his own, that means, well, then God isn't in charge of the devil? Or God is allowing this to happen. And we can zoom out to, it's a teaching tool and all of that, but that I'm still struggling with that question. Why would God allow so much misery and sin and hurt? And we might not get the answer. We might get the Job answer, right? But that's what we're wrestling with. Like I said, next week, the next chapter that I'll look at, hopefully it has some good things. That's all the footnotes, by the way, just for that chapter. Okay, did you see that? You can't see it at home, but I will count the pages for you.
You did some scholar research there.
I think that book is
Yeah.
over my head.
3,
I know it's over.
4, 5, 6, 7. That's around 8 pages of just footnotes for just this one chapter. 137 different footnotes.
Somebody did a lot of research, right?
And he's reading stuff all the way back to the early church fathers, and then reading centuries of commentary on what they said, and other biblical scholars digging into the language and archaeological stuff from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so
And you didn't have any friends or any.
all their friends are also biblical scholars. A little bit. So the next chapter is the state figure in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay. Yeah. And then the Satan figure in the Second Temple period. So that's that time leading up to Jesus. And then Satan and his other names, question mark. We've kind of touched on that already. And finally Satan in the New Testament, and then Satan and the devil in the early church conclusion. I don't know how much of this we're gonna have time for, because we'll have to wrap this up by Lent. But yeah, that's what's ahead. So I will try not to get us bogged down in all the language stuff moving forward. I think we've, much like Balaam's donkey, I think we've beaten that horse. Okay. So, but we'll try to do a little bit more of the overview stuff and sort of the history of where our current conception of the devil came and how that plays out in terms of evil and our response to it and our responsibility for it. Okay, I've talked a lot. Any other thoughts, questions?
We don't, where did the time frame come that the devil was painted with a horn and all that? Did that come? Wasn't in the Bible, right?
Red suit and horns.
Right.
I don't know that it's biblical.
Well, the
Unless it's
reason
in
my
Revelation.
question is, if they made, going back and say it's just Christianity,
Yeah.
if they made the devil look like Jesus, that would kind of not have the same effect of you trying to.
he's gotta be the opposite.
Or did they take after Loki that had horns, who was the great deceiver and liar?
Yeah.
And I don't know what the Romans had, but you know,
Yeah, at one point he did mention other figures from the surrounding cultures with horns or red. There was an Egyptian god who was red. And so it's possible that as they were trying to figure out how to talk about the devil, they picked up on some of these other images and said, that
this ought to work.
Yeah.
A little bit.
Scare the heck out of us.
And I don't think it's unfaithful to say that, because we know that the church, the human institution of the church, has turned to using fear to keep people in line. And so, yeah, let's make a boogeyman, right?
Yeah.
There's also a discussion that using that image has actually downplayed the devil
Yeah,
and made a comic character out of him.
Yeah.
So people dismiss that, oh yeah, the devil.
yeah. I mean, how many Far Side cartoons have,
Mhm.
tail pitchfork horns, red suit?
The Flintstones, the guys popping up in the shoulder as a kid growing up, it was always,
Yeah.
Or, have anybody ever seen, The Emperor's New Groove? Very underrated Disney movie.
Yep.
Hilarious, very good. Yeah, they've got that in there too. Looney Tunes. Yeah. So yeah, if you make it into a comic caricature. But there again, maybe all of this is a misdirection. It's all about the devil, whether it's real or a caricature or a punchline, or the screw tape letters convincing people he doesn't exist. The devil's behind all of it. Yeah, then we're worried about the devil more than we are ourselves.
I just look at all the bad things in the world, and most of it you can trace back to their home environment, their neighbor environment, not the devil. I mean, I don't know, that's why I have a hard time with the little guy in the red suit.
Yeah.
I've taken too many psychology courses again.
And there's about, a dozen different shows or movies that say, oh, well, their demons are real and they are possessing people and they are making them do bad things.
If they're demons, it's called poverty and,
Oh,
the things that caused this in the first place.
poverty, hunger, inequality,
Right.
depression. Yeah.
When I behave abominably, I would rather believe that there was a devil out there who really led me into doing it,
Sure.
than to think that it was my own personal nature
Oh,
that
sure.
all of a sudden I couldn't control.
Because you want to blame somebody else
Or
besides
maybe
yourself.
somebody else.
Yeah, if you start having conversations about changing your lifestyle to help with hunger, racism, any of the isms, poverty, you're like, oh wait, I had a part to play in this? No, that's just evil, I'm sorry. It's just an evil world, I'm sorry, we'll just have to wait for heaven until it gets better. Yeah, way easier just to write it off and not have to change your way you live.
Excuse me, I'm not sure.
Yeah, okay.
And that keeps going through my mind is, where do people normally turn to God if they're not there already?
In times of trouble.
That's right.
And that's something that got brought
So
up.
is that a tool that God's using to get people to come to him?
Then I'd say from my perspective, that's a pretty crappy way to do it. Yeah, I read a thing from a guy who got nicknamed the Ethiopian Bonhoeffer, Yadina Tumza. And the stuff he and his wife lived through poverty and war and just unspeakable things. And then he was a Lutheran pastor, bishop of the Ethiopian Lutheran Church, spoke truth to power in the North American and European churches to say, the way you're running things is not serving the gospel. We need to do things a different way. We need to help the whole person, their body and their spirit. This trailblazer in the 70s. And one oppressive regime of monarchy got switched out for a socialist or communist oppressive regime. And they had him killed because they didn't like the following that he knew it was a threat to them. And I'm like, okay, so he was a martyr and it helped a lot of people come to faith. But did all this other stuff have to happen? for him to get to that point, for him to have this beacon of light of faith that he had that inspires people still today when they read his story. Did we really have to have all of that misery and suffering and evil? You know, guards torturing prisoners for no reason except they were Christians. Did we have to have all of that? I have a hard time.
But
It's just one.
I keep going back to God sees the big picture.
Yeah,
And so in the big picture, and we know the end game,
yeah,
we kind of have to keep that in mind too.
Yeah.
And it doesn't negate all the evil that's in the world, and it doesn't make it, you feel better to know that. But I just wonder about that.
I do too, but when I wonder about that, it makes me uncomfortable.
And look at 9/11, the
Right.
day after 9/11, how people poured into churches.
Yeah.
Now, how many of those people actually came back, you know,
Yeah.
but
Not level back off.
in those times, that's when people tend to, you know, my thoughts and prayers are, you know.
Yeah. But I can't help but wonder, like, just like Christian evangelism, if we go out doing fear, it doesn't work, or at least it hasn't for a long time.
Mm.
People don't join the church. People don't become deeply faithful Christians because they're scared of going to hell. They're just scared. So if that doesn't work for our evangelism, I guess I have a hard time attributing that same approach to God, scaring people into faith.
Well, maybe it's not that, maybe it's not the outward scaring of people, maybe it's what is in people already that scares them,
Yeah,
that God addresses.
and God always turns bad towards good, evil towards good, so the bigger the bad, the bigger the turn.
Mhm.
I guess I could do that, but then I feel like I'm the one doing a lot of theological gymnastics to make it work. And
Well, when it comes down to it, we're the one who has to make the choice.
yeah,
Always.
yeah. Great conversations, everybody. Kinda have
Good,
some topic.
yep.
We have a book here if anyone wants to